Or consider this quote by Adams. He said, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other."
Like many other Christian nationalists, Dr. Jeffress deceptively refers to any quote by any founder that says God as proof that they were Christians, even though John Adams was a Unitarian who did not believe in the divinity of Christ. If you told Dr. Jeffress Jesus wasn't divine, he would say you're not a Christian. But if John Adams says he believes in God and he's religious, that makes him a Christian founder.
That's an amazing concession. When our nation turns to secularism and away from God, we have no document that can keep order in our country. Our forefathers designed this country and they wrote the Constitution with the assumption that people would be guided by a belief and obedience to God.
Again, the presumption is that he's talking about the Orthodox Christian God, even though the statement is coming from someone who is not an Orthodox Christian.
Consider what the words of John Jay, the first, as well as the privilege of interest of our Christian nation, to select and prefer Christians for their rulers. Did you hear what this first Chief Justice said? Not only are we a Christian nation, we have a duty to prefer and select Christians as the leaders in this Christian nation. Why, he would be hauled into court today and sued for saying such a thing.
I'm pretty sure the First Amendment would protect his right to say that, just as it protects us from your establishing your religion as the national religion.
But that was the Founding Fathers. That's what they believed.
No, that is what that Founding Fathers and some others believed. You continue to mislead people.
If you really want to know what this country's founding was all about, Adams said, go back to the beginning. The American Revolution bonded together in one indissoluble bond, the principles of civil government with the principles of Christianity.
Keep in mind that his father, John Adams, was quoted earlier in the sermon. The full quotation that Jeffress didn't give his followers showed John Adams saying that atheists, deists, and Protestants who believe nothing all agreed with the Christians on the principles of Christianity. So what they're calling the principles or precepts of Christianity clearly did not refer to the divinity of Christ or even the belief in God or any Christian creed, but apparently referred to the right of conscience to be free of religious coercion. John Quincy Adams was hired as a lecturer at Harvard and refused to submit to a general test of religious beliefs, saying, "I must question their authority," that's the Harvard staff authority, "to require my subscription to a creed not recognized by the Constitution or the laws of the state." And it's generally believed that he actually believed what the creed was that Harvard wanted him to submit to, but he thought it was none of their business to require a subscription to any creed.
What about the separation of church and state? That was the foundation of our Constitution. I had this week a reporter ask me the very same question. "Pastor Jeffress, what about the constitutional separation of church and state?" I said, "There is no such thing." He said, "What do you mean there is no such thing? It's in the Constitution." I said, "It's nowhere in the Constitution. You find it for me. Point it out to me." Did you know 69% of Americans believe that phrase is found in the Constitution, the separation of church and state? It's not found anywhere.
Perhaps you can tell us where America is a Christian nation is found in the Constitution, or the word God, or the word Jesus Christ, or Christianity, or the Bible. There is nothing like that in the Constitution. It is the godless Constitution. Even the presidential oath does not contain the phrase, "So help me God," something that was not repeated by a president taking the oath until nearly 100 years after the founding of the country.
Not in the First Amendment, not anywhere. Well, then where did that phrase come from? You have to look outside of a government document to find it mentioned the first time. The first time that phrase was used was in a private letter between President Thomas Jefferson and a group of Baptists from Danbury, Connecticut.
Speaking of Baptist, Roger Williams in the early 1600s was using, if not the phrase, at least the concept of separation of church and state, and he founded the first Baptist church in the United States. In the 1960s, when I was a kid, I learned in a Baptist church less than 40 miles from Dr. Jeffress, First Baptist of Dallas, that this separation of church and state was a fundamental principle of the Baptist denomination and our religious heritage. That was before people like Dr. Jeffress and Paige Patterson took over the Southern Baptist denomination, coincidentally, at the same time that I left.
In 1801, now think about 1801, that would have been 9 years after the ratification of the First Amendment. In 1801, most states still had state-sponsored churches.
The First Amendment only applied to the federal government. Congress shall make no law. That included all First Amendment rights: free assembly, religious freedom, free speech, free press. Until the 14th Amendment, states could and did violate these rights.
But they were sponsored by Christian denominations. And in many states, the tax dollars you paid went to that state-sponsored denomination, whatever it was. In Connecticut, the state-sponsored denomination was the Congregational Church. And so a group of Baptists were upset about that. They didn't want their tax dollars going to support the Congregational Church. And so they had to petition every year to redirect their tax dollars back to support their Baptist church. And they got tired of that hassle of doing so. And so they wrote a letter to newly elected President Thomas Jefferson asking him to rectify the situation. So on January the 1st, 1802, Jefferson wrote this letter back to those Danbury Baptists. And this is what he said in part, quote, "I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people, which declared that their legislature should," and then he quotes the First Amendment, "make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof," end of quote, thus building a wall of separation between the church and state.
The letter of the Danbury Baptists say nothing about the hassle of having to petition each year for their tax dollars to be sent to their church. They referred to what religious privileges we enjoy as a minor part of the state, we enjoy as favors granted and not as inalienable rights. And these favors we receive at the expense of such degrading acknowledgments as are inconsistent with the rights of free men. Jeffress' spin completely ignores the sentiment that the Baptists were actually complaining about, that they were treated as second-class citizens because of religion and were only being granted religious freedom by the majority religion instead of being held to the federal Constitution. You have to wonder, is this what Jeffress wants for the rest of us, for those of us who are not Orthodox Christian, to be treated as second-class citizens who are not part of the majority religion? The next sentence in their letter is insightful. Those who seek after power and gain under the pretense of government and religion. That is a reference to those people who violate religious freedom. It's a reference that could easily be talking about Dr. Jeffress and other Christian nationalists.
Now, the context of this letter is so obvious. He's quoting the First Amendment. And the First Amendment being quoted is in the context of one Christian denomination being elevated over another Christian denomination. It was creating a state church in which people were forced to worship or forced to give their money to. And Thomas Jefferson said, our forefathers did not want that. They had given that up in England. They wanted a country in which they were not forced to worship. They were not forced to support. The context of this was the elevation of one Christian denomination over another Christian denomination. Never in their wildest imaginations did Thomas Jefferson or the Founding Fathers ever believed that that First Amendment would be perverted in such a way as to try to separate our country from its Christian heritage.
So it never occurred to a deist that religious freedom applied to anyone except Christians.
You say, how do you know that, Pastor? How do you know that wasn't Thomas Jefferson's intent? Well, look at his own actions as president. 1 year after he wrote this letter to Danbury Baptist, 1 year afterwards, he signed a bill to use tax revenue to support a priest going to minister to the Kaskaskia Indians.
We'll pick up on this deception in Part 4.